Will a lot of this depend on the type of responder that they are? Because this is something that I've been fascinated that's come out of your Instagram. So like a type 1 responder, I think it's more linear and quite consistently linear versus is it type 3 where you might hit a plateau, but you keep going because you know in like 2 or 3 weeks, they're just going to see this peak suddenly happen. Would you be able to give a bit more of an overview of the different types of responders and then how you relate your RPE programming to that?
Sure. We notice generally 3 types of responders, and this is originally comes from the work of Dr. Anatoly Bondarchuk, who's a former Soviet throws coach, coached hammer throw, shot put, and also coached in Kuwait and Canada. I believe he still coaches in Canada. Anyway, his work is kind of where I came into contact with a lot of these ideas. And then we saw similar patterns in powerlifting as well. So the idea of response types, we noticed 3 different types. A type 1 responder is, as you mentioned, fairly linear. They just kind of get better from one session to the next. And that's the most fun. It's definitely the most fun.
Most fun being the athlete, I'm sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's nice to just, success week after week and, you feel like things are going great and there's no stopping you. But, I mean, that's great when it can happen, but this is also something that I think, as of right now anyway, is outside of our control. So we can't really choose your response type. It just kind of happens, and we have to be prepared for it. So like a type 2 response has their performance in week 1, a nominal performance in week 1. Then week 2 is actually a regression. And then week 3 sees a return to baseline or thereabout. And then from there on, week 4, 5, and so on would be progression. So a small dip in the beginning and then progress thereafter. That one is slightly less fun in the early stages, but after that you're pretty much in a similar pattern to the type 1 guys. So that can be fine. Type 3 is probably the most difficult to cope with, and that's what you mentioned earlier, which type 3 is kind of this static sort of performance where nothing much seems to be happening. Performance is fairly flat from week to week until the very end of the block when there's a sudden peak. And there could be like a small dip before that peak as well, but the main feature is that it's this kind of long, flat phase in the beginning of the block. And it doesn't have to be perfectly flat. There's always some variance in your performance, but pretty much not a lot of improvement, definitely not clear trends, just a little bit up, a little bit down, a little bit up, a little bit down, but it's fairly flat through the beginning stages. And that one's difficult to deal with because you're doing this training, you're working hard, but you don't have anything to show for it until the very end of the block. And it's also worth noting that part of the reason that's difficult is that there's not a guarantee of the payoff at the end. Are you in a type 3 response block, or is this just not working? Well, you kind of have to go to the end to find out. So that's not a lot of fun, but knowing what your response type tends to be, it's not always the same, but kind of knowing what it tends to be is helpful. Just to give an example of that, I was working with a lifter. She's preparing to go to the World Championship, and we're about 3 weeks out from the World Championship. So kind of this critical training stage where everything should be coming together. And she had a really bad training session. And she sent me a message. Was, not crazy upset, but was definitely bothered by a poor performance. But I was able to go back to her training data and show her the patterns and say, look, this is normal for you. You always have 2 sessions of improvement and then 1 session down. 2 sessions of improvement, then 1 session down. So here we are 3 weeks out. This is your down session. And from here, we're going to have 2 up sessions. And that final up session is going to end at the World Championship. And sure enough, that's what happened. She had a fantastic day at Worlds. But it's much easier to get that buy-in, and it's much easier to look past those difficult moments when you have kind of a clear established pattern that you can go back and refer to and say, oh yeah, this always happens like this. I can just, keep the faith and it's going to be fine.